So I've been thinking a little bit about thinking, and I've been thinking a lot about everything, which sounds confusing, and it can be at times. But sometimes when I just talk, even if there's nobody listening, or nobody else listening when I'm talking, I can learn almost as if I'm talking with someone, because when I have to speak, I have to put words quickly, to improvise language about a topic. What ends up happening is that if I do it well, I learn a great deal in the process. So what I'm going to do right now is just talk a little bit about what I've been thinking just in the past few moments. And I was thinking about the difference between what most of us have, which are jobs, and what we might like to have, what I think perhaps we were born to have, if I can be bold enough to make statements for everybody. A fairly silly thing to do unless you're pretty sure of yourself, but in this case I am. I think what we would like to have is roles. And here's why I think that. We love to read stories. And we, as a people, all over the world, all of the moderns anyway, they love to watch movies. And actually, even people who are indigenous or close to indigenous that I know, I guess there aren't really any such people. Let me say that a different way. People who identify as indigenous like movies, which is interesting to me, because when I was having the kinds of experiences that really deeply connected me to myself and to nature, movies weren't uninteresting, but my life was way more interesting. So going to a movie would be more like going to the bathroom than going to a party, if that makes any sense. I would have interesting responses, but it was only because everything was interesting. And so a movie was also interesting. I could learn lots about what the culture was thinking and stuff like that. That isn't really my point. My point is this: we really love stories, and we love them too much. We love them way too much. In fact, a movie like Avatar, for example, which presents some very compelling fictional roles and hyperboles, which many of our favorite stories are based on, hyperboles, that is, gross exaggerations, was a wildly popular film. I don't think too many of the people that watched it realized that making the film, supporting the film, producing the film, distributing the film, all the people driving around to watch it and paying for it and working to pay for it, and all of the things we had to do to watch it, all the things we had to move and store and back up and build and transport, all of that stuff we did to make and watch that film, all of the money we spent and are still spending, all of the toys and books and little things we made, all that effort was spent against us and against the virtues and the promises and the visions of the film itself. Very ironically, in other words, nothing attacks nature like a blockbuster film. So a blockbuster film about saving nature is like using the fact that we can tell a story to kill in a very ironic and lethally poisonous way, where everyone thinks it's a celebration. It's a celebration of what's being assassinated by celebrating it that way. And this is part of the difference between a job and a role. See, in a job, you're sort of told what to do, and you're given a framework to live in and be, and you're serving to reinforce a system that's oppressing you. And not just you, but it's oppressing distant others all over the world. And it's not just them, it's oppressing living beings in every place on earth and deep into the future. Now, that's a real problem. Oppressing all living beings. I know it sounds bizarre, but it's actually true. The way that we do business in the modern world is destroying every living thing on earth all at once, not like in little pieces or here and there. No, it's filled, for example, every animal body on earth, and probably every plant body, with deadly toxins, actually. You can learn about this yourself. Your body's full of them. And they disrupt all of the biological processes that life and evolution both, not just life but evolution, that's the important one, depend upon. So that we're not just destroying ourselves now, we're programming a series of unpredictable destructions in the future. This is what we've been doing now for quite some time. This is the result of a job, having a job. This is what jobs are supporting, pretty much no matter what we may otherwise think, because if we're in any way participating in the culture, paying taxes, etc., voting, then we are, we're signing up for our own incredibly ironic and ugly departure. The role, on the other hand, is what we go to worship in the stories. Isn't that interesting? So instead of having roles and becoming real people together and having a culture that is in fact heroic and beautiful and true, like what we were promised in, for example, America, probably the Soviet Union, and probably China, and probably Japan, and many other nations, right? A culture that is, instead of having a culture that is actually a group of heroes learning to be amazing and beautiful and human and alive together with and for all of the other groups and for our children and our world. Instead of doing that, we're doing the opposite, but we're making the movie. And boy, does it sell. Oh, this movie sells like nobody's business. It's being sold everywhere you look. And the farther away our lives move from anything like roles that are inhabitable and roles that are true to our natures and the promise of our birth, which is so profound that if you took all the stories and all the religions and put them together, the promise of our birth would stand like Mount Everest next to the grain of sand those stories are. And of course, in this case, it wouldn't be sand. Because sand is a beautiful and natural thing. It would be like a chunk of a broken machine or garbage, that little tiny thing, yeah. But the mountain would be a real mountain, a living mountain. Because that's the difference between the potential that is born in us and the ones that our religions and our cultures sell us. And so, one of the interesting things about a role, and we see what a role means in films. Of course, I'm unfortunately going to have to refer to films because this is the only way you're going to understand me, or stories. A role is a thing like Frodo in The Lord of the Rings. A role is where you actually live your life as a being struggling with the fundamental nature of existence and the forces that your birth both brought together and brought you here to transform. And that's what you came to do. I don't know the exact shape of it. No one does. You can discover it. Only you can discover it. But I know a few things about this strange idea. I know, for example, that you have powers. I don't want to call them supernatural, but if you were to experience them, you certainly would think they are, that go beyond the sum of our stories and beyond the sum of our religions. And I don't want to tempt you with them, because that would be fatal. In fact, the powers are about, they're about as interesting as your shoes, really. You wouldn't want to get too fascinated with your shoes, as for reasons you can well imagine. They're meant to carry you somewhere, not to show off with or to get fascinated with. But you have powers inside you you've never imagined. And you're being sold garbagey copies in the New Age market and on television and in books and by coaches and hypnotists and in religion. That's way, way less than what you could bring. In fact, if you brought forth even half of the role that you came here to play, instead of having to have a job or a business, you would have the power to change a nation in a week, because every human child does. So I'd like you to think very carefully about the difference between a job and a role. And I also want you to look now with me at the people that the culture lifts up above us as examples that we would like to think of as people who have roles. Right? And these are people like gurus, Osho, Eckhart Tolle, Deepak Chopra. Not that these people, I named a bunch of men by example. Unfortunately, Oprah is a well-known feminine purveyor of roles and supposedly role models. Perhaps the president's wife. But of course, forgive me for not being on my feet about some of the women. But I think it's because a lot of the women are professional psychics, or they appear as spiritual leaders. But for the women, they tend to be mediums and channels and coaches and things like this, and I'm just not quite as familiar with their names. But my point is, let's look at some of the famous people, and also, of course, so we've got actors, sports figures, rock stars, or shall we say music stars, film stars of any kind. Authors are kind of heroes, and they're a little closer to the ideal too in some ways, because they are actually trying to transform the culture in a secret fashion that's pretty powerful. Music could be, but is mostly co-opted, so it doesn't turn out to be. Film could be, but is mostly co-opted, so it doesn't turn out to be. But back to this point, all of our role models that are lifted above us, that they're supposed to show us or help us define, aren't succeeding. They haven't produced one individual, and they do not represent such an individual. They haven't produced one individual with even a tenth of the powers that they were born with, and the freedom from culture, listen to that last part, that's necessary to activate them, right, to discover them. In other words, you kind of have to get near the edge or outside of human culture to have any real chance of discovering what your role might be or what your opportunities to have one look like. Because inside of human culture, what you're going to get is a job. And that's what most of these people, who are our teachers, so to speak, or our role models, are showing us. If you get a really good job, you'll be paid lots and lots of money. Well, that's the representation of something none of us have ever seen, which is that if you get a really good role, and I don't mean get by being hired, I mean if you inwardly invent a really fantastic role, you're going to receive something so astonishing that you're going to understand what money is the representation of, and there's no way I can explain what that is. Now, here's the really interesting thing about this whole process. No one knows anything about it that's useful except that it's real. So no one can tell you what your role is or what the other worlds that you can participate in are like, or any of those things. And anyone who does they probably have a job, and they might want you to have a job with them. Because what's actually going on is so astonishing that the moment you make a story of it, you've ruined your chance to see it. And even what I just said is dangerous for that reason. But at least I'm slightly aware of that fact. So most of what we have in our culture is jobs, and even our role models are actually people who just have jobs, right? And they're not really they don't come from outside the culture returning with these amazing opportunities and gifts and assets and ways of relating and seeing and learning and becoming together that come from people who have traveled way beyond human culture, examined it from outside, and seen what's on the other side, whatever that may be for them, and come back. Unfortunately, most of the people who do that get jobs, and then they have to sell us a picture of that process, which unfortunately any picture you make of it is a lie. You should say that up front if you're going to do that, because every person is so unique and so unbelievably, strangely, beautifully, perfectly profound that you can't make a model for everybody else. And even the one I'm making here is a little dangerous for that reason. And if you try to sell someone some kind of a model, or like tell them that they're psychic, or tell them that they can heal people, or even things that we know are relatively objective, like hypnosis, which is a real thing, you can do it. You're sort of inventing a cage again, and you're trying to sell something. And once you do that, you're not exactly in a role anymore. Although there are some kinds of roles that involve storytelling. That's true. I'm inhabiting one of them now. So what I want you to see is that a role is something you were born with. You came here with one. And really it's not so much that you need to get one as retrieve that sense in you from within you, from your birth. And since we are in fact all of our ages, not just one of them, we are all the ages we have ever been, and we are even all of the ages we have ever been in many different ways. That that whole process is still inside you like a seed. And culture's job is basically to shut it down and co-opt the urgency that you feel about this process, about why you're not able to have a role. And you secretly know this every time you feel that rush of elation and ecstasy and the profusion of power that comes when you see heroes doing what you know you can do more than in stories and films. And it's so confusing to see these images of heroes doing what we know we can be much more than, but we never get anywhere near being that. We kept getting sold the story over and over again, and we keep coming back for more, but we never get to be that. And why is that? And that must change, and we must change that together, come hell or high water. Because the representations we're being sold are a theft. They're an egregious theft. And they're not just a theft from us. They steal everything that is true and good and human and beautiful. And not just from us, from the future. Everything. We cannot live this way. We must have roles, not jobs. And if we are to have jobs, then the roles must come first and the jobs second. At very best. Much like a certain kind of thinking must come first and another kind second. In the same way that we've got this backwards in our cultures, we've got this backwards in our lives. And unfortunately for most adults, we've never seen this other kind of thinking. And most of what we've been sold about it are fairy tales and science, and neither of them are anywhere near it. They're nowhere near it. The fairy tales remember something, we have no idea what they're talking about. And science is the peculiar prosthesis of the other side of the mind. It's not going to reveal to us what we need to know. And the people who think, oh, if you just bring these together, everything will be great, they're grossly mistaken. You don't bring teenagers having sex into the surgical theater and think that if you just manage that, then everything would be just fine. That's a ridiculous idea, and that's the essentially same idea of trying to merge science with our incredibly crude and primitive ideas about metaphysics that are commonly popular in our time. So again, what I'm trying to say here is the difference between roles and jobs. Born with roles, given jobs. We ache then all through our lives for roles, and we're going to have crises where we come right up against the opportunity and the difference, right? So we're going to have crises where we feel the strain of all of this, but we can't speak it. There's no way to say this unless someone has, sort of said these words or helped you say them before, unless you can discover them in yourself, which is challenging. We're going to have crises, and during these crises, what's happening is that seed inside you is shivering. It could crack, and that crack could be very dangerous, because if you don't know this, what you could end up with is what I'll call an emergence crisis. You're trying to emerge while the culture is shutting you down, medicating you, and you've also been trapped in such a way that the emergence attempt is probably not very well funded in terms of the resources it needs to succeed, either extrinsically or internally. And so these emergence events are likely to go haywire and turn into psychosis, paranoia, extreme mania, extreme despair, depression, and all of these things. A lot of this has to do with the fact that we're trying to be born, and the process has no support. And even if it did, what is trying to be born has been so inhibited throughout our lifetime and so punished and amputated and tortured that it's really hard for it to have any kind of a reasonable emergence. It's not impossible. We can help each other probably discover how to do it again. I think we would be very surprised at what that process might look like. I don't think it would look much like we imagine, put it that way. So what happens is we come up against this conflict over and over again. This is part of what we see when people pull a gun and go out in public and kill a bunch of people. They have realized that they've been trapped in a job, and they're trying to be crushed into something that isn't a role, and they sort of in desperation somehow, they're having, all of these feelings are happening during an emergence event. They realize like the whole world is the enemy, and if they're not going to give me any role, then I'm going to take the role of the teacher villain signal, and they just go out and make a huge signal, right? And finally they have gotten the what is unfortunately the dark polarity of the role. They've gotten what is left over, which is of course what creates crime, right? And also this is a vast source of crime, is that we need roles, and instead we have jobs, and jobs don't really work for a lot of us. They work for other people. By the way, I have a job, and the job has been very difficult. Having a job has been a constant part of my life, but a very, very difficult one. A cruel and vicious one that punished me for working and paying to work. And still does. But anyway, we can see that people who fail to emerge might grab onto roles that we are confused about. The reason is they were given no opportunity to have roles, and they were injured and tortured as children, like most of us were by the culture, even if we don't think so. It's because the basic features of the culture deny everything I'm saying, and they have to survive. If any of us had roles, our cultures wouldn't make it. Our religions would not make it. The structures of power and authority over what stuff is, what it means, those would not survive us getting roles. In fact, people with roles come to transform the culture, and they come from outside in. They may start within, but then they go outside and they come back in. So this is why authors can be this way. It doesn't mean they are, but if they're really, really powerful, and if they're doing something really true, and not just trying to sell a story to role-hungry, role-starved, role-deprived human beings, then they'll give people back the sense in the story, right, that this isn't a story. This is about you. This is about an invitation. This is about a set of signals that are calling you to remember. To remember things so powerful that if we started to remember them again, we wouldn't be able to sell movies. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine being so excited about our own lives and each other that it'd be really hard to drag us to a film ever? And that our children would be similar? Because we've forgotten what is being represented on those screens and why it is so fascinating. It's something inside us. And the more we watch it on the screen, the more it's driven from our lives. And once we begin to recognize this, we will have one of the keys to changing it and to learning how to discover and support roles for each other. Heroic roles instead of jobs. Not because the world needs saving, or because there's some dogma, although the world does need saving, quite frankly. But because what we're doing now is not like ourselves. So let's discover what that is together in a way that is open, intelligent, creative, playful, true to nature, our nature, and all that we can know and become. If we're doing anything else, we're doing too much work for the wrong outcome. And people say, well, that's impossible. You can't change the world overnight. They're out of their minds. You can change the world in a heartbeat. The whole world is aching to change. And if it doesn't change overnight, it's going to die. That's exactly when you can change the world, overnight, with nothing more than a story that helps us remember and understand our real opportunities, our real obligations, and our actual responsibilities. And let's face it, they're a lot more serious and beautiful than we've been willing to think yet. So let's think and act a little differently together today. From now on, in everything we do, I will. Will you? If you can just say yes, that's a beginning. Let's do it. I'm with you.